Take a look at it. Have we studied everything this semester for nothing? And it's always good to know that you studied something for 3 weeks intensively and found out that it's not good and not useful. But we're going to come to some conclusions about that. If you remember in chapter 12, we were looking at substitutes, neutralizers, and enhancers for leadership. And this was the last. There were 2 slides that I wanted to go back over just to make sure everybody got them, because it was we were going quick. What we want to do is think about, if you recall, neutralizers and enhancers in particular. If we say, and substitutes, if there is a substitute for leadership, what does that mean? It means that there is something that will take the place of the leader behavior. Okay? Something in the organization, something in the work task, something in the group that replaces that leader behavior. A neutralizer is something that neutralizes the leader behavior, and so it makes it less effective. And of course, an enhancer would be something that would increase the leader behavior, right? So the last reading we were looking at was the meta-analysis of all of the discussion about this. And let's go back over this just quickly. On average, the combination of leader behaviors and substitutes for leadership accounted for the majority of variance. Okay, so what's that saying is if you take leader behavior and substitutes for leader behavior, that accounts for the majority of variance in employee attitudes, role perception, and a substantial part of performance. Now, if you went back to the article, you'd find out that it broke down in the following way. When we looked at employee attitude, what's really important is to realize that this up here is very significant to these. Now, they actually broke them out into percentages. I'm not as concerned that you know those percentages. They did go over those in the study. But what I want you to realize is that when you take leader behavior and you take substitutes and add those together, they account for more than half of all of the things, including employee attitude, performance, etc. Okay? And then the second part is, on average, substitute for leadership uniquely account for more variance in the criterion variables than do leader behaviors. So that's the second point, which simply means that the substitutes oftentimes are more important than the leader behavior. Okay? Yes?
So in first point, majority of the variance in the employee attitude. Variance and what? Not sure.
Okay. No, that's a good question. Variance in terms of change. Think of variance as the change that occurs. Okay? So if we think about the change in employee attitude, the change in performance, that more than half of that is accounted by leader behavior and substitutes. Okay? And then the second part of that says, of the 2, substitutes account more than leader behavior in that variance score. Think of change is the easier way to think about it. And then the third point is, on average, about a third of the variance explained in the subordinate criteria variables can be accounted for by either leader behavior or the substitutes. Now, this is just focusing on subordinate criteria, which were a very specific kind that they talked about. Don't worry too much about that. The big thing in this slide is the first 2 issues. And then the last point is, it's important to keep in mind that substitute for leadership variables are supposed to be moderators of leader behavior and subordinate criteria variable relationships. In other words, they are, if you think about leader behavior and you think about subordinate criteria, and by subordinate criteria here we mean perception, we mean role performance, those kinds of things. If we think about those 2 as like this, then the substitutes ought to come in between. They ought to be the moderators between those 2, between the leader behavior and essentially the subordinate outcome. Okay? And then the last point is, it's important for future research to improve our understanding of the theoretical mechanisms through which substitute variables have their effect. I mean, we can measure, and in this meta-analysis measured these substitute effects. I can talk about what they are, but we really don't understand theoretically how they work. Okay? We don't have a theory that explains it to us. We can see that they exist, we can measure that they exist, but we don't have a